Okay, new video time with the poor quality we always have. So I got this helmet from my neighbor. He had bought it and he wanted to finish it himself. But he's come to realize that it's not as easy as it looks sometimes. So there's some yellow on here. I don't know what that is, and there's some green over here. So I'm not sure if he was painting it or what he was doing. But I've already started sanding it, and I'm going to sand it one more time, try to get off as much stuff as he can. Then I'm going to prime it. So usually I like to start with the PLA and paint it, but I'm not going to go right down to the PLA with this. I'll just try to get it smooth and prime it and see what I have. And if it's really bad after I prime it, then I will just take some 80 grit paper and rip everything off this and start over. But I wanted to see if I could get the sound, because someone asked me about the sound I listened for. So I think there's some, I think we're at PLA here. Let me see if I can make the two sounds. So you can hear the sandpaper rubbing. Of course, it's not going to make any sawing noise. So what you're listening for is it's like a sawing sound. And once you've hit that, that's when to stop. Once it hits the PLA, it makes a real saw sound. Let me get a new piece of sandpaper and see if I can do it. Okay, so that's sanding material. There's that sawing sound. I've hit the PLA there. Should be able to hear the difference. So I'm going to sand this helmet till I hear that, if I can, everywhere. So that'll be close to the PLA. It'll hit the PLA in parts. And once it's done, like I think I've already mentioned, I'm going to prime it and see what I've got, and then start our process on it. So this is the next project that's up. Another Mandalorian helmet. Okay, I have the Mandalorian helmet back from a light priming. I just give it a light coat. So you can see stepping on the top still, and you should be able to see, let me hold that further away. You can see the lumps in it if you look up at the dome from filler or whatever it was, paint. I'm not sure what he did. You can see some cracks along the side, chipping. So once you put the primer on, you get a really good view of what's happening, right? Let me see if I can zoom out a little bit here. There we go. So what I think I'm going to do, instead of sanding over and over and over and killing myself, I'm going to paint this with our paint and give it a good sanding. So any cracks, I saw a bunch of cracks. There's some back here. You can't really see them on the camera, but I'll fill them in with our paint. Let me see if I get in close on some of these. You should be able to see some cracks in there. So I'll fill them in with our paint, but I'll give it a really good sanding. Like, I'm not going to mess around with the sanding. I'll go right down to the primer or lower if I have to. So you can see like a lump right here where some filler or something's all gathered. So very quickly, I'm going to just paint a little bit just to mention a few things. I'm going to go with the big brush because I got a whole helmet to do. So if this was the PLA in a normal start, you know, I would start off. Can I get that in the camera? There we go. I would start off going with the layer lines, so they would be like this, right? And I'd use my brush kind of like a trowel and just use the edge of it just to kind of make sure I push it down into those lines. And then once I have that done and it's all finished, right, then I would just smooth it out. Just give it a nice smoothing. The smoother it is, the easier it is to sand, right? You don't want to leave big piles and hills that you got to sand through. So you want to get it nice and smooth. So that's how I normally do it. And then when I sand it, I go over the whole helmet once, the whole helmet again. As a bit of science, whenever anything dries, like paint and even resin too, I think, but any substance that dries, right? Moisture is coming out and going into the air. So on the surface, if you went down microscopic, you'd see a little forest-like structure, right? As the water goes out and it pulls some of the material upward. So when you first sand it, it kind of feels a little rough and picky because of those structures, and you sand them off, and it's very easy. And that's why I like to start in one spot and then go all the way around the helmet, because by the time I get back, more little structures have formed on the paint that's left, and it's easier to do again rather than stay in one spot, because it takes 24 to 48 hours for most things to cure, so to completely dry. But dry to the touch, maybe in 15 minutes I could touch this, right? But after you sand off the top layer, the next layer down is not as dry as that top layer was. Even though it would feel perfectly dry to you, there's still more moisture in it. So as I'm going around the helmet and doing it, this second layer that I've exposed is now drying and getting a little kind of rough, and then you can sand that. It's easier to sand that way rather than to stay in one spot and take it all the way down, as a little tip I found anyway. So that's what I'm going to do to this helmet. I'll paint it all. I might even do 2 coats, and I'm going to give it a really good sanding and try to get out some of these lumps. So I'm going to go right down through the primer in some spots, and any that I miss, the next coat of primer I put on, they'll show up. If you make a mistake, the primer will tell you. So that's really the secret, right? Is to be able to see and predict what the primer is going to show and not show. And you can use iPads or phones and use the camera to help zoom in and see. Good lighting, if you hold it up to the lighting and move it around, you should be able to see if there's a nick or a hill or a valley. And I was going to mention something else too about doing this, if I can think of it. When you're starting out, like the first time you do this, I would just prepare to do 2 or 3 rounds, maybe even 4 or 5. The first couple I did were like 7 rounds, because there's a little learning curve to it, and there's some skill to sanding. If you want to try to do it 1 round, and if you don't get it, and you've primed it, and then you realize when you primed it, you left some mounds of paint here and there, you now have to sand all the way down through the primer again. So if you're starting out, if you just do 2 or 3 rounds, or prepare yourself to do 2 or 3, and make sure you sand the first layer right down to the PLA, so you see all those stripes, the PLA color plus the gray from the paint. And then the next round, when you prime it, go right down to the primer. You probably have a lot easier time. And then as you advance, something that would take 4 rounds will then take 3. Something that take 3 will then take 2. And of course it depends on the print settings too, right? So 0.1 millimeter layer length I can usually get at the first round. 0.2 millimeter, sometimes I can get it the first round, sometimes 2. 0.3, it's almost guaranteed at least 2 rounds. And as it gets bigger, right, the more rounds you have to do to get a perfect job. And if you're weathering these helmets and things too, right, you might not have to do as many rounds because you're going to beat them up anyway. So anyway, I've yapped enough, so hopefully that helps out a little bit. I'll paint this, sand it, and then come back at that point. So the helmet is now all painted. So I'm going to give it a really good sanding. I'm going to try to sand all of this paint off, so just the pieces that are left to be the ones in grooves, and hopefully get rid of most of those lumps that were in this helmet. So I'll be back. There's not much point showing the sanding, so I'll just sand it and prime it. Come back after it's primed, see what we got. All right, I'm back with my neighbor's Mandalorian helmet. So I painted it all with our paint, and it was nowhere near as hard to sand as I thought it was going to be. I just sanded it down normally. So anywhere you see on here, the little dark patches, that's where the paint had to stay to fill in. But he just came by, and this is pretty smooth in most spots, kind of like glass smooth. And he's happy with that. He wants to take over now. Saved him from whatever it was that happened before. So I guess I'm not going to get to finish this. I was going to sand it one more time right here, but it looks like there's a blob here, but it's actually not. It's just the color change is actually making it look like that. I held it up to the light and checked it out. So unfortunately, I don't think I'm going to be doing any more to this. I think he's going to come take it. So I'll just move on to the next little project I have. So this is the Mandalorian helmet for the neighbor. It's primed and he's going to take it back. He doesn't want me to spend any more time on it. He's happy with this, and so am I. The paint worked well. It filled in every gash and crack that he had made or that was there, and most of the little hills weren't big enough that our paint plus the filler primer spray pretty much covered most of them. There's a little bit there he could sand a little bit, but that's up to him. So I was looking forward to tackling the cheeks again, but I'm going to have to leave it here.